CEO Belittles shoe shiner, but the past comes back to haunt him. James Sullivan straightened his $1,000 tie as he strode through Grand Central Terminal. At 38, he was the youngest CEO in his company's history, worth over $50 million, and his arrogant stride made sure everyone knew it. An elderly man sitting on a small wooden stool caught his attention. The man's weathered hands worked methodically, polishing a businessman's shoes. His clothes were clean but worn, years of hard labor etched into every line of his face. "Excuse me," James called out sharply. "You're blocking my path." The old man looked up, his kind brown eyes meeting James's cold stare. "I'm sorry, sir. Just finishing up here." James scoffed, loud enough for nearby travelers to hear. "Look at you, sitting on the ground like some street beggar. Don't you have any self-respect? A man your age should have accomplished something by now, not crawling around polishing other people's shoes." The elderly man simply nodded quietly and continued his work, never showing anger or resentment. "People like you are what's wrong with this world," James continued. "No ambition, no drive, content to stay at the bottom while real men build empires." He pulled out a $20 bill and threw it at the man's feet. "Here, charity case. Maybe buy yourself some dignity." The old man didn't reach for the money. Instead, he finished the businessman's shoes and stood slowly. "Thank you for your feedback, sir," he said simply. "I hope you have a blessed day." James shook his head in disgust and stalked toward his train. He didn't see other people staring after him with disapproval. He didn't notice the businessman quietly pressing an extra tip into the shoe shiner's hand. But most importantly, James didn't recognize the face that had been watching him with quiet sadness, a face that had once been his salvation 20 years ago. The train ride to his penthouse gave James time to review his quarterly reports. Profit margins and acquisition deals filled his laptop screen. This was his kingdom of success, built through ruthless determination. He'd worked 18-hour days to get here, sacrificed relationships and peace of mind. But it had all been worth it when he'd escaped the poverty that had once threatened to crush him. As his private car pulled up to his Manhattan high-rise, James felt satisfied. He'd come so far from those desperate college days when he'd barely had enough money for ramen noodles. But something nagged at him. The old man's response, not anger, not begging, just quiet dignity. It stirred an uncomfortable feeling James couldn't name. Meanwhile, Antonio Romano climbed 3 flights to his modest Queens apartment. At 72, his legs ached from the long day, but the familiar pain had become constant. He set his shoe-shining kit by the door and hung his jacket on a hook. The apartment was small but clean, filled with photographs, pictures of a small diner, smiling customers, a younger version of himself behind a counter. "How was work today, Papa?" His daughter Mia looked up from her laptop, concern flickering across her features. She'd been trying to finish her nursing degree while working part-time. "Interesting day," Antonio replied, settling into his chair. "Met someone who reminded me of the old days." He didn't mention the cruel words. There was no point burdening Mia with the world's small cruelties. But as Antonio closed his eyes, he felt a familiar stirring in his heart. The same feeling he'd gotten years ago when he'd seen hungry students in his diner, too proud to ask for help. 2 days later, James found himself taking this same route through Grand Central. The elderly shoe shiner was there again, working quietly in his corner. This time, James almost walked past without a glance. But something made him stop. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was curiosity about why the man hadn't taken his money. Whatever it was, James found himself approaching the corner where Antonio worked. "You didn't take the 20, James said without preamble. Antonio looked up calmly. "Didn't need it for what it was meant for." "What's that supposed to mean?" "Money thrown in anger doesn't buy dignity, sir." It just spreads the anger around. James frowned. There was something in the old man's voice. Not bitterness, but a kind of gentle wisdom that made him uncomfortable. You could have used it. Could have, Antonio agreed, buffing a customer's shoe with practiced strokes. But some things are more valuable than money. Like what? Antonio glanced up with those same kind eyes. Peace of mind, the ability to sleep at night knowing you've done right by people. Something in those words hit James unexpectedly. He stood there for a moment, watching the careful, methodical way Antonio worked, before walking away without another word. But he thought about those words all day. It became a pattern over the next 2 weeks. James would stop by Antonio's corner, sometimes just watching, sometimes asking brief questions. He told himself it was morbid curiosity, but deep down, he knew it was something else. You ever regret not taking easier paths? James asked one morning, genuinely curious despite himself. Antonio considered the question while working. I've taken many paths in my life. Some easier, some harder. But I've learned that the easiest path isn't always the one that lets you sleep peacefully. Sounds like something someone says when they don't have real responsibilities. Perhaps, Antonio replied mildly. Or perhaps it's something someone says when they've learned that real responsibility includes how we treat other people. James felt stung, but couldn't argue with the gentle way it was delivered. Another day? Why do you do this work? A man your age should be retired. Retirement is for people who did work they didn't find meaningful, Antonio replied. I've always found meaning in serving others. The form changes, but the purpose remains the same. Serving others, James repeated skeptically. That's a luxury for people who don't have to worry about success. Antonio paused in his work and looked up. Success means different things to different people. I've known successful people who were miserable and people with very little who were genuinely happy. Happiness doesn't pay bills. Neither does misery, Antonio replied with a slight smile, but one of them lets you sleep at night. 3 weeks after their first encounter, something shifted. James found himself looking forward to these brief conversations, though he couldn't explain why. You remind me of someone I used to know, Antonio said one morning, his voice thoughtful. Yeah? Who's that? A young man I met many years ago. Very driven, very ambitious. He succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, but I often wondered if he remembered to take care of his soul along the way. The words hit James unexpectedly. What makes you think he didn't? Antonio looked at him directly, and James felt as if the old man could see straight through all his success to something broken underneath. Because wealth without compassion is just expensive loneliness, Antonio said softly. That night, James couldn't sleep. He found himself thinking about the desperate college days he'd tried so hard to forget. Days when he'd felt truly alone, when dropping out had seemed inevitable. And then he remembered the small diner on 42nd Street, the kind couple who had somehow always had extra food when he needed it most. The warmth of those meals, the way they'd tasted like hope when he'd had so little left. He remembered the owner, a gentle man with kind eyes who had treated him like family when he'd had no one. The memory made his chest tight with an emotion he'd buried for 20 years. The next morning, James approached Antonio's corner with a different energy entirely. His usual arrogance was replaced by something closer to nervousness. Antonio, he said quietly. The old man looked up, and there was something knowing in his expression, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. You remember? Antonio said simply. Romano's family diner, 42nd Street. James's voice was barely above a whisper. You're him. You're the man who fed a hungry college student for 6 months, Antonio finished gently, who watched him struggle with pride and determination and hope, even when hope seemed impossible. James felt his carefully constructed world tilting. But how? I mean, you recognized me? Not at first, Antonio admitted. It took me a few days. 20 years changes a person. But watching you these past weeks, seeing glimpses of who you used to be underneath all that armor you've built. He smiled sadly. You still have the same eyes when you're thinking deeply about something. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because you weren't ready to hear it, Antonio replied. The man who threw money at my feet 3 weeks ago, he would have seen it as weakness, as leverage. But the man who's been stopping by, asking questions, genuinely listening, he's starting to remember who he used to be. James felt tears building in his eyes. I became everything you tried to teach me not to be, didn't I? You became successful, Antonio corrected. That was always the goal. The question is whether you remember why success mattered in the first place. To help people, James whispered, remembering words spoken over a plate of chicken parmesan 20 years ago. You told me that when I made it big, I should remember to help others who were struggling. And have you? The question hung in the air like a judgment. James thought about his ruthless business practices, his treatment of employees, his complete disconnect from anyone who wasn't as wealthy and powerful as he'd become. No, he admitted, his voice cracking. I forgot everything. I forgot how it felt to be hungry, to be desperate. I forgot what your kindness meant to me. I forgot that someone believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. He looked at Antonio, really looked at him, seeing not just a shoe shiner, but the man who had quite literally saved his life. The man whose quiet generosity had kept him in school, kept him fighting, kept him alive when he'd been ready to give up on everything. And he saw what he'd become in contrast, someone who would humiliate that same man in public, who would throw money like it was charity, who had lost every trace of the humility and gratitude that should have defined him. James fell to his knees right there in Grand Central Station, his expensive suit forgotten as he knelt before the man who had been his guardian angel. Other travelers stopped and stared, but neither man noticed. I'm so sorry, James sobbed. I'm so sorry, Mr. Romano. I became everything you taught me not to be. I forgot everything that mattered. Antonio knelt beside him, placing a weathered hand on James's shoulder. It's never too late to remember, son. Never too late to find your way back. 6 weeks later, James stood in front of a small storefront on the Upper East Side, holding silver keys. The sign above read, Romano's Shoe Repair and Fine Leather Goods. Inside, Antonio arranged tools on custom-built shelves, his weathered hands running over the beautiful workbench. The shop was warm and dignified. Everything his corner at Grand Central had not been. You didn't have to do all this, Antonio said, eyes bright with gratitude. James smiled genuinely for the first time in years. Yes, I did. This isn't charity. This is justice. He'd also quietly handled me his tuition and established scholarships for struggling students, finally understanding what it meant to lift others up. One more thing, James said, pulling out a framed photograph of the original Romano's family diner. I thought you might want this. Antonio took it with shaking hands, tears filling his eyes. Rosa would have been so proud to see how you turned out. I hope she would have forgiven how long it took me to remember her lessons. Antonio hung the photograph behind the counter. She always said, kindness is never wasted. Sometimes it just takes a while to bloom. As James prepared to leave, Antonio called out, "You know, I never did get to finish shining your shoes properly that first day." James looked at his expensive leather, then back at the man who had saved his life twice. Without hesitation, he sat in the customer chair. "I'd be honored, Mr. Romano," he said quietly. As Antonio worked, both men understood this was about much more than shoes. This was about dignity restored, gratitude expressed, and the quiet miracle of kindness that had waited 20 years to complete its circle. Outside, the city rushed past, but inside the small shop, two souls had found their way back to each other through patience, wisdom, and the understanding that true wealth has nothing to do with money and everything to do with the connections we make and the kindness we show to one another. Sometimes the greatest wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch along the way. If this story reminded you that kindness is never truly forgotten, please like this video and subscribe to Soulful Stories for more heartwarming tales that celebrate the power of human compassion.